But what are we talking about here? We're talking about qualities of a brand that are source identifying. Obviously the name, the logo, the design, sometimes it's even the shape or the configuration, like the Toblerone box that you see here. Color can be protected and can be owned. The Tiffany blue box, you see that blue and you know that it's Tiffany. And there are even some interesting things beyond what's normally protected as a trademark, like sounds. Think the Netflix sound when it starts. Smell. Did you know that if you create something that smells like Play-Doh, you are infringing Play-Doh's trademark? They own a trademark in the smell of Play-Doh. I don't think that's going to be an issue for us, but it is a fun fact. Color, Tiffany blue. And so the long of the short of it is something that identifies a brand. You see that element, you know that it belongs to that brand. If I ask DALL-E 2 to create an image of somebody wearing red-soled shoes, I've never said Christian Louboutin, but Christian Louboutin owns that trademark in those red-soled shoes. He's fighting for that trademark in almost every country around the world. You don't want to do that. That's going to be a problem. You need to know if you're creating things that some of these could be an issue. The next is copyright. Copyright. So copyright is the big one. Copyright is the term that is thrown around constantly with generative AI. And there are so many questions about copyright. One, are creations that you make protectable? If I make something, can somebody else just take it and use it for any purpose because I have no rights over it? Two, how are these things created? How have data sets been created? How has AI been trained? Am I using somebody else's copyrighted material? So what do I mean by copyrighted material? Literary works. And literary works is broad. It's not just those award-winning novels. It's an article, any blog post that's posted online. Those are your words that you've strung together. It's your creation. You have protection over it. Somebody cannot just take it and plagiarize it. Literary works also includes software code. And software code is known as a literary work for copyright protection. You can't just take somebody's software code that they've created. That person has rights to it. Also dramatic works, musical works, sound recordings, motion pictures, sculptures, etc. It's original works of creation. Okay. Patents, we can do this one quickly. Most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with patents. These are for new and useful inventions, novel things, non-obvious things, functional, useful things. There is a subset of patents that aren't often talked about. Those are design patents. And so we usually think of a patent as it protects some utilitarian or functional purpose. Design patents actually protect ornamental features. So a picture of something, a design, a drawing, an item of clothing. Even when you're creating generative AI, you might not realize that patents are at play too. Okay, trade secrets. These are some old trade secrets, but trade secrets is highly confidential, valuable information that your company or you have, you keep it secret, and you take steps to keep it secret. What does it mean to take steps to keep it secret? You have confidentiality agreements and NDAs, and it's just the most highly sensitive information that you have in your company or you have with your creations. And again, the key to proving you have a trade secret is that it has to actually be secret. So I'll give you a spoiler alert for later. If you input that into AI or some kind of tool, is that secret anymore? Or have you just lost protection over it because you've put it into a data set? And what presentation is not whole without a picture of Lindsay Lohan in a bikini? This is right of publicity. And this is, you cannot use somebody else's name, image, or likeness without their consent. This is an old case. This is a case where Lindsay Lohan sued a video game Grand Theft Auto because she claimed this person in a bikini was actually her. She lost. But had it really been a picture of Lindsay Lohan, the game would have had a problem. And so to the extent you're asking AI to generate pictures of certain people, you might have a problem. There's also been some questions of create me some art in the style of Van Gogh. Are you using Van Gogh's likeness, or not his image, but his name, his likeness? I think that's a stretch, but there are current ongoing litigations bringing right of publicity claims based on the style of type of work. So that's something you need to think of as well. So look, those are our main categories of IP. Let's turn this back to actually generative AI, and you can understand why we're talking about these categories of IP.
I think one of the underlying currents is clearly not, well, at least as far as I know, none of the copyright laws or these laws or this construct were written with this world in mind.
That's for sure.
Is there anything that you're aware of that, then we also talked about in prep about the idea of regulation. Is there anything that you're aware of that you're seeing that may be working its way through that could set a precedent or could apply or could in some creative way to apply to maybe this type of legal work that's coming our way?
I mean, this happens over and over and over again. We saw it with the introduction of the internet. We saw it with the introduction of the domain name system. I have several cases right now involving NFTs, and people in the courts are going absolutely crazy. And I'm like, this is just like when the .com started. IP does not change just because we have a new medium. And I think that's the one thing that's important to remember is we have the laws, we just need to adapt them. And it's what makes my job so fun, frankly, because we do keep adapting them. Now, there is a regulatory framework that we're seeing for AI. There's a new EU AI law. It's still in draft form, but it is expected to take effect later this year. And the EU law says there are different risk levels depending on the types of AI, and that if you're dealing with this, you're going to have to do a risk assessment. And so it has all different things where you're going to have to assess, and you're going to have to monitor, and you're going to have to keep track of. Now, the United States doesn't have anything like that yet, but one will follow eventually. And what we are seeing in the United States is state-specific laws that are coming into play, and also sector-specific laws. So right now, Colorado, I think in one of the biggest regulations that we've seen so far, Colorado has passed an insurance law that says if you're using AI in the field of insurance, there are certain things that you have to do. New York recently passed a law dealing with AI in the hiring process. So if you're using AI tools in the hiring process, you need to have certain audits of those tools to make sure that there's no bias. And again, this is just small pieces, but the states are going to catch on. They are catching on. There's been lots of talk about this. There are commissions formed. The Federal Trade Commission just this week put out a warning and said, hey, if you're advertising AI capabilities, we're watching you. We're forming a new task force to look at this specifically, and you better make sure you're not over-exaggerating those AI capabilities. And so that's just one example, but we're going to see this over and over again. And aside from that, we have several current cases that are pending, some of which I'm sure you've heard of already. But they go back to these same questions that I said in the beginning. Can AI content be protected under the existing IP laws? I think that the answer is yes, but we're going to have to get creative. And frankly, Leo's presentation today gave me some great ideas, and I can talk about that in a minute. But then also, is it infringing our current IP laws?
Yeah. This is, a little bit of a crystal ball and philosophical question. One of the things Eric Schmidt said this morning is this is not human, this is math, and this is search. So if blog posts or those writings are copyright protected, and this is in essence using that as a data source, do you see something like, is it going to have to change by n degrees, or is this unavoidable, or can you sort of look into the future and maybe opine on that?
So that's the big issue right now. Everyone has been, or every one of the agencies or the bodies that regulate this have been clear. If it's not created by a human, we're not giving it copyright protection, we're not giving it patent protection. These patents and copyrights exist. We are trying to incentivize human creation. We're trying to incentivize monetary reasons for creating this. We're trying to protect goodwill. And we're not just going to turn this over and say a computer can do it, because then doesn't that harm humans? But then you hear the story from Leo and all the work that went into just creating the image that's used on the tote bag for this event, and you realize there's a little more to it. And there are some people fighting this right now. So if you've heard of Stephen Thaler, he is an AI activist. It's the only way to describe him. And he currently has litigations pending in several jurisdictions around the world: the United States, Australia, the EU, the UK, there are several others. And he has a AI tool called Dabis. And Dabis created this image that you see on the screen here. And so far, every single organization that he's applied to for either patent or copyright protection has said no. Straight up, no. And so he's suing them all, saying you're wrong, that I created this, I am the creator, I made this tool, I instructed this tool to do it, I'm the creator. The patent office, he's already done in the patent office in the US, they've just said no. He has sued the Copyright Office. The case is still pending, and he basically said, like, your decision was arbitrary and conspicuous. It's not right. Again, I made this. I should get copyright protection over it. I'm a little doubtful that he will get it, because what he's not doing is showing those extra steps that Leo described, for instance. Like, there's going to be some minutia here. Was it really just a machine that did the work, or what? How did you do the work? How did you create this? More interesting on the copyright front, though, is this Zarya of the Dawn comic book. And so this decision just came out either last week or the week before. And this is it's a comic book by Christina Kashtanova, and she puts this out. And by the way, you can see these are the images here. It looks the woman in it looks very similar to Zendaya, so there hasn't been a right of publicity action yet, but it's one I could see brewing if Zendaya doesn't agree with her image being used here. And so what Kashtanova did was she created the images for her comic book using Midjourney. But then she put the text in and she put the images together in a compilation. She applied for copyright protection, and she did not disclose that AI or Midjourney played any part in this. And the Copyright Office said, yep, this is core copyrightable material. This is art. This is the compilation of images and text. You get a copyright registration. The Copyright Office then got wind that Midjourney was involved in this, and it issued a revised opinion. It said, oh, no. You actually don't have copyright in these images created by Midjourney. They were created by AI. They're not protectable. But you do have copyright protection in the text and in the way that you arranged the images. The author put out a text afterwards and said, oh, this is great, this is a win for creators, and by the way, my lawyers are looking at creative ways that we can explain to the Copyright Office that I actually did create these images, that there was more to it than just typing a prompt into one of these applications. But so some people see it as a win that there is some copyright protection available for this, but what are you actually protecting? Is anybody else going to take these images and arrange them in the same way with this particular text? The protection is so thin that it's really problematic. And then I'll address these very quickly. The other big copyright cases. Sorry, it's like I have to press it a certain way to get it to work. There's two cases pending, the Anderson case and the Getty Images case. They've both sued Stability AI, and they've sued, is inclusion of copyrighted material in the training data infringement. And so these are tools that scrape the web for images to train the AI on. You can then, of course, put in the text prompt and get an image. Getty and Anderson are both saying, those are my copyrighted materials. Any image you create is a derivative work from my copyright. A derivative work is you have taken my copyrighted material and you have changed it to create something new. But what a copyright entitles you is I'm the person that gets to decide how that work is used. You can't take it and change it. That is a derivative work of mine. That's not something you're allowed to do under the copyright law. And so these are going to be really interesting to see how these cases turn out. And then there's also a similar case, oops, I went one too far. Maybe I went one too far this time. Anyway, there's a similar case where there are some unnamed plaintiffs suing Microsoft and GitHub, similarly about the Copilot application, which spits out code, and that scrapes GitHub for code, and then will spit out some new code for you. And what the plaintiffs are saying in that case is through OpenAI, we had a license, an open source license, and I said you could use my code, but you had to attribute it to me, and you had to put a copyright notice, and you also had to include terms of service. None of that is happening with what's coming out of Copilot, and therefore this is an infringement. The defendants have filed a motion to dismiss and said there's nothing here, we shouldn't even have the case at all. So, these are really cutting edge cases. They're not gonna answer all of the questions. I predict what's gonna happen is many different courts are gonna look at this. Many different courts are gonna answer the question in opposite ways. And we're gonna have a number of years in which it's a little bit unclear what you're actually allowed to do. So you're gonna have to be pretty careful.
Interesting. Turning a little bit, sort of crystal ball now, is within business models and business context. And I think right now most applications that have this built in or have it embedded are personal use applications. So summarize these meeting notes, write emails for me. Some students just write papers for me. In a future state,
problematic, yes.
Yeah. In a future state, if there were to be a scalable, public-facing company with thousands and thousands of users with this embedded underneath it, is there a way that you would advise that how could you manage risk, or what you would need to watch out for, or what the possible penalties or remedies could be?
So it's so important to monitor this. We've put out some blog posts at my firm about this, like you're using ChatGPT, should you let your employees use it? What should you be doing to protect yourself? And because, part of the problem is that there's not regulations yet, and the law is not decided yet, so it's a little bit up in the air, but AI governance is more important than ever, especially because it is up in the air, and what you need to do are take steps to protect you as an employee using it, to protect you as an owner of a company where employees are using it, or even as somebody who is using it to develop your creations. And so for companies, the advice we give is, first of all, take the time and do a risk rating. Like, look at how you're using it. There's different uses of these things. If I'm using ChatGPT for personal use or for business, what am I using it for? Am I putting confidential information in there? Am I putting information about employees or information about clients? Like, there's privacy concerns, there's confidentiality concerns. Am I putting my copyrighted creations in a place where they might get scraped into a data set? And do I not want those there? And do I not want somebody infringing them? So do a risk rating. Is it a high, medium, or low risk? And then decide, is it worth proceeding? Take inventory of what you're doing. It's very important to take inventory. Make sure you know what your employees are doing, what you're doing in the creation, just in case you have to talk about it later. You should train people. You should be transparent. So if you are putting out material into the world for public consumption that has been created by AI, don't hide that. Let people know that it's been created by AI, because then you won't be misleading them. We're worried the FTC is looking at these. Are you misleading consumers? There's Unfair and Deceptive Practices Acts that the state AGs are dying to get in on this. Like, don't have it be you. There's just regular false advertising. So you need to be very careful there. And it's just, keeping records, knowing what you're doing, and paying attention to it is the most important thing. The other thing I would say is if you're a creator and you want to protect your works so other people can't use them, pay attention to copyrights. If it's something really important to you, register your copyright. Opt out of data sets if you're given the option. And also consider licensing terms. Like, if you're putting something on the internet, consider more stringent licensing terms. If somebody is using it, make sure it's clear that you can't use this. Or you can't put this as part of a data set. You can't use it as part of AI because it will protect you later. So there are lots of different things you should be thinking about.
There's 2 minutes left, so I'll end with this. Are you optimistic?
I am.
We're going to be able to figure this out. It's not going to be a shit show for the next couple of years, or maybe it is, or maybe it's both.
So I laughed when Sydney made this comment on the last panel. And she said, I'm a lawyer. And I just laughed.
The buzzkill session.
Totally, I'm here to, like I said, to start. I'm going to throw cold water on all of this. Absolutely not. I'm totally positive. I believe, when you hear, I keep bringing up Leo's presentation, but when you hear presentations like that, there is more to it than simply putting a prompt into a AI application. I think that these applications can be so useful, but like I said, you just need to pay attention to what you're doing every step of the way. I don't expect you to leave this presentation saying oh, I know exactly what I need to do, in order to make sure I have no legal issues. But what I want you to get out of this are the buzzwords of what you need to pay attention to, who owns the IP? Am I using confidential information? Are there trade secrets? Are there privacy implications? Is there anything I'm doing that's unbiased? I'll give you a quick example. In Hungary, now again, this is not the United States, there was a company that was using an AI tool to monitor customer calls, and they were taking the tones of the customer voices to see are our customers happy, and they were using that data to analyze it. They ended up having to pay the EU a 700,000 euro fine because it said you were using this AI data, you were taking it for your data set without getting consent from the consumers. 700,000 euro is a lot of money if you're a startup company trying to start something. So again, just pay attention to what you're doing, and there are a lot of resources to get legal advice on these types of things.
Thanks. I think that's all the time we have. Great, thank you.
Happy to answer questions after. What?
Have you seen the article with lawyers?
Oh, yes, I have. A knee replacement document production. That's fine with me.
All right. Thank you so much to both of you. Up next, we have a talk on the future of work.
Last week they sent last week. The marketing team sent last week. I hope he's here because they did meet on the panel. They pushed it back. Wondering where Tom is.
We'll get started in just a few moments. We're just waiting on one more panelist to return. Alrighty. Thank you so much, everybody. If we can all grab a seat and get settled in, I will hand it over to Joseph to get everything started.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Allow me first to thank the AI ML Club leadership, in particular Sid Sriram, Sam Broner, and the rest of the team for organizing the summit. Welcome to the panel on the future of work in the GenAI economy. I'm Joseph Webby. I'll be the moderator. And just to clarify, I'm part of the AI expert network at World Economic Forum. So I wanted to introduce the great guests we have here today. Professor Tom Malone needs no introduction. We can't have a panel on the future of work without Professor Malone. He wrote the seminal book in 2004. So thank you so much for being here. He's a professor of management at MIT Sloan. Dr. Catherine Havasi is a technology strategist, AI researcher, and entrepreneur. She's a pioneer in human AI collaborative intelligence and co-founded ConceptNet, the first project to use crowdsourcing to train AI. She previously directed the Digital Intuition Group at the MIT Media Lab, where she taught NLP and entrepreneurship. Dor, he's the co-founder and chief business officer at Bridgewise. Dor is changing the way we invest and understand capital markets through banks, investment houses, stock exchanges, and brokerage platforms. Thank you so much for being here. So while much of the world realized the potential impact of generative AI with the rise of Stable Diffusion and ChatGPT, the research community, the academic community, the entrepreneurs have been at it for several years. And regardless of the technology, AI is about the people, the stakeholders who each have a goal. And we're probably in the greatest AI ecosystem in the world. So we're here to talk about the people behind what makes GenAI and AI work. So we have these three incredible guests, and we're going to try to cover specific topics because each of them brings expertise in certain areas. So we want to talk about how you achieve your GenAI goals as a student, as a researcher, as an executive, as a workforce leader, as a future founder, also a government stakeholder, and even AI ethicist. So thank you very much. To start off, there is no formal definition on what is the GenAI economy. So Catherine, if you could start us off with that.
Sure. I think it's interesting in that we can sort of frame what we think of as the Gen AI economy with the way we used to talk about the internet economy. Now, there's a couple people in the room who probably remember the internet economy and when internet was pull downs. If you said, what industry are you in, you could pull down and select internet. And now the internet is part of what we do on a day-to-day basis and part of every business. It's kind of table stakes. So that's kind of where we are with, I would say, AI as a whole right now. We still say, oh, I'm starting an AI business, I'm using AI, I'm using generative AI, but eventually it's going to be an enabler in other types of businesses, and it's just going to be part of the framework of everyday applications in what we do.
Definitely, and just to get your perspective, Tom, you wrote the book on future of work in 2004. What are the economic effects of the Gen AI economy?
So I think one of the things people worry the most about is whether this is going to take jobs away from people. But I think we've worried way too much about that. I think the Gen AI economy is going to eliminate some jobs. It's going to change lots of other jobs. And probably more important than either of those, it's going to create a lot of new jobs that never existed before. So I think if you're concerned about the future of work is what the jobs will be, we should worry less and imagine more.
Definitely, pushing the imagination is a theme that's been repeated all over today, so great point there. Now, looking at the business side, Dor, how do entrepreneurs, those entrepreneurs in the room, how do you generate business opportunities in Gen AI? Maybe identifying the voids to fill as entrepreneurial opportunities.
So, first, thanks for the opportunity. Generally speaking, I believe the bigger the technology disruption is, the bigger the opportunity for us entrepreneurs is. So looking back at the internet revolution, it changed, like some of the biggest companies we know nowadays grew up from that revolution. So Google changed the way we access information, and Amazon changed the way we access consumer goods. I can keep on going. Facebook changed the way we access each other. So I believe AI, and specifically Gen AI, will change the way we generate or create intellectual products. And being very specific, it will enable us humans to become the cyborgs or the augmented human and augment our skills. Being specific, I believe us entrepreneurs should go after the markets that, or the products that will create the win-win situations for all value chain participants, and not create the replacement of AI replacing humans, because that will create pushbacks from the consumers, from the users, because no one wants to be replaced. So for example, I can of course, from Bridgewise's perspective, all of us invest in the capital markets, right? All of us do agree that financial statements has some effect on the performance of the stocks we invest in. What was the last time each and every one of us read the financial statement of the companies we invest in? 99% of us never read the financial statement of the companies we invest in. And so again, such augmentation tools will enable us to become better investors, better bankers, better wealth managers, et cetera, et cetera. So those are the kind of opportunities I would seek if I was an entrepreneur, which I'm doing actively nowadays. So that's my opinion on that.
So is it almost looking at the value chain and disaggregating the value chain to find those opportunities?
Again, finding the win-win situation for, of course, the tech and the users, and again, across the whole value chain. Another example, stock exchanges. 80% of the trading volumes are being focused on 20% of the stocks, which is not, it doesn't make sense, because it doesn't make sense that 20% of the stocks are the whole opportunities in the market. So that happens because we know less about the other companies that are listed in those stock exchanges. So again, GenAI can bridge the gap of us knowing stuff on undercover or underserved products, et cetera, et cetera.
Great. Catherine, let's get your perspective. You're also a serial entrepreneur and AI practitioner focused on natural language processing way before it was a thing. How do you turn those business opportunities into generative AI questions and specifically to productize it?
I think anytime you're productizing AI, you have to think use case first, business impact first, right? Don't come out there, don't say, I have a new algorithm, it's a great algorithm, I'm going to commercialize it, and then find the use case. You have to go the other way around. So start with the business problem, think about the impact that that has to a particular market, to a particular user and user base. Start there and then find the best technology that exists, or come up with the best technology that exists to be able to address that problem. Going out, learning how to do what, the discovery, right? What we call discovery, being able to talk to customers, understand what underlies their business problem. That's always going to be important. And, I think within the community, we're still talking about how can generative AI help us do that faster, which is a whole different topic, but it still remains that companies that are the most successful are the ones that find the business need first and the algorithm second.
Great. So business need first, algorithm second. We'll come back to that later. Tom, your work on designing collectively intelligent systems is foundational. How does your view of this idea generating machine change with Gen AI? And in your book, Superminds, you provide a very comprehensive taxonomy for designing these human-machine partnerships. Does that change in generative AI?
So I think that generative AI doesn't change the taxonomy we had of different ways intelligence could operate. It just fills out another example in one of the cells. So I think it's maybe useful to think of this as a kind of roadmap of where AI may go and how humans do things today and could use AI in new ways. In the book Superminds, I talked about 5 different core cognitive processes that any intelligent entity needs. The first is deciding things. If you're going to act in any way, you need to decide what action to take. To do that, it often helps to create possibilities for what you could choose to do. You can usually do both of those 2 things better if you can sense the world around you and remember the past. And if you're really smart, you can learn from your own experience to do all of those things better and better over time. So those are the 5 cells in this taxonomy: decide, create, sense, learn, and remember. I think generative AI is about the create cell, and I think there are lots of exciting things to do there, but also lots of exciting things that we haven't even thought of yet to do in the other 4 types of cognitive processing.
What's really exciting in the create cell for you?
Well, we've been working for a couple of years with GPT-3, so we've been working with the large language models, generating short stories and ideas about strategic planning and things like that. We've been recently working with image generation as well as part of a way of stimulating creativity in the early stages of design for physical objects. So I think all those things are really exciting. I think the most interesting things are to think about what we haven't thought of yet. You know, what are, for many kinds of human intellectual activity, what are some of the pieces of that where generative AI could help do it faster, better, more creatively, et cetera? And then what are the pieces that humans will do still when those parts of their activity are super amplified by the technology?
Great point on the super amplification. Dor, at Bridgewise, you're using AI to replace or eliminate cost of highly skilled jobs. Tell us about that, and what does that look like also for other industries?
So quite the opposite, to be honest. We try as much as we can to avoid eliminating, of course, ultimately jobs or roles within the organizations we serve. Because in the end of the day, the stakeholders or the users within the organizations we serve are humans and also the decision makers. And even if we'll come up and say to the CEOs of the organizations and firms, listen, we save you 30% of the cost by eliminating such and such, it will not happen again because the end users are humans, and we humans, we do not take decisions in a rational way, but in a more emotional way. So we will not be able to practically create large businesses by saying we will eliminate humans in the value chain again. But we try to do it again in a more augmented way. We try to show the users within the organization how we'll enable them to make their day-to-day struggle easier. Taking, again, a large bank, one of the largest in Latin America markets, instead of saying to the wealth management advisors, listen, we'll replace you, we'll make the advice instead of you, we'll just say, listen, instead of making the research yourself, going into the spreadsheets, writing the reports in multilingual products that you provide your clients with, we'll do it for you. You'll do what you like the most. You'll interact with the clients, you'll think about the best way to enhance their portfolios, etc. We'll do the heavy lifting for you as the AI, again, augmentation tool, and you'll keep your job and focus on what you do best in a way that it will, eventually it will provide the firm with more value because the clients are happier, the actual employees are happier, and of course we are happier because we send the check in the end of the day.
Do you feel like there's maybe multiple decision-making units that you have to convince them of this change?
Yeah, of course, again, of course it depends on the actual client in the end of the day. If you serve SMBs, so it's less of a concern, but if you sell to enterprises, like we do, so you have, again, to go through different stakeholders' motivations because each and every one has a different motivation, either business, finance, or again, some other motivations that the organization may have. So you have to, again, think in advance how you design both the product and the business offering in a way that it will match, again, each and every motivation of those different aspects of the firm you serve, and not tackle it throughout the meeting or throughout the relationship, the sales cycle.
Great. So it sounds like something similar to an AI assistant coworker. So Catherine, some of your thought leadership is around planning for this techno-collaborative future. What would it look like having that AI assistant as a coworker?
So I think to some degree, people already have AI assistants as coworkers, and I'm going to talk a little bit about where that happens and what we've learned. I think I'm sitting in Sloan right now, so I want to quote the last year's Sloan BCG AI Executive Survey that basically said, over the last couple of years, they've been doing a number of different survey questions, and in 2020, they had a question that showed that essentially people who are seeing real value, real operational revenue value out of AI were doing something beyond just augmentation, closer to collaboration. And so I think that's really interesting. It's the human is learning from the machine, and the machine is learning from the human. And it's this cycle, right? If they followed up with those companies a couple years later, and something like 60% of the people who are actively using AI there thought of the AI more like a coworker than a tool or a threat. And I think that's really interesting. And we can see that happening in a couple early adopter industries. I've done a lot of work in customer service, and all of you have seen the little thought bubble box in the bottom right. When you click on that, sometimes it's a little unclear to you whether you're talking to a person or a machine, right? Everybody's had this experience. That's because sometimes it's both. There's products in the market today that are pretty widely used where an agent can start talking to you and then click a button, have the AI take over for a fairly rote set of interactions that person has set up, and then it'll come back to the person when they need help, and they're managing many conversations that way. So those people, when you talk to them from a design standpoint and from a UI perspective, they think of that as a coworker and an augmentation of themselves. When we did this with storytelling at the Media Lab, we had this really fun tool. We had real storytellers come in, like the Moth and NPR, and they would do speech recognition while they were telling a story. And we built this really fun, immersive visualization based on the story that they were telling. And I think one of the things we didn't expect is when we interviewed everybody afterwards, they all said they felt they were collaborating with the machine and that was largely positive, and it pushed them in creative directions they weren't going to go before. So I think people naturally fall into that. If you go back to that survey, people who felt that they were a coworker with the AI were about 3.4 times happier with their job than people who didn't. So we're going to see a lot of that.
So the idea is informing the user that they're interacting with the AI rather than on its own.
Well, I think that's part of the trust side of it as well, which we're not doing right now because everybody who clicked on that little thought bubble doesn't know when it's the person and when it's the AI. But it's also kind of a funny question about when is it the person and when is it the AI, because it's kind of both, right? And a lot of my work right now is in regulated industries. And in regulated industries, there's regulation pathways for a person made this decision and a pathway for a computer made this decision. But as we start exploring the gray area, how do we think about that? How do we regulate that? How do we work with that? And I think that's a big question.
So whose job in particular would be affected or augmented in this case?
And the one I'm thinking about is, I don't know how many people know any of this, but when you open a bank account, there's all these anti-money laundering regulations, and companies go through and they check you and they make sure that the people who are coming in the door are not, say, sanctioned or gotten arrested for racketeering in a foreign country, all of this stuff. So they employ bodies of analysts who go through and use these tools, right? And most of the time, it's entirely false positives because, most people have not been arrested for racketeering in a foreign country. So, how do you go through and automate and speed that up, but you can't, from a risk and regulatory perspective, take the person out of the loop, right? So how do you keep them, so when the real positive does show up, how do you keep them from missing it? And I think that's the question.
So part of that also is educating the regulator on the usage.
Oh, absolutely. And I think when we think, and this was probably covered earlier as well in one of the other panels, when we think about how do we approach this from a government perspective, I think we all need to educate everybody in government and in everywhere, everyone on the street about how AI works and what it means. And there have been a couple great programs for that globally, but I don't really see one here in the US that has taken off.
Great. I think it was mentioned earlier, if the regulators get involved, it slows the innovation down. So that's maybe a point. Tom, one topic that wasn't covered today is government. It feels like maybe they should have a role with all these large language models, or learn how to use it with all the data that they have. What opportunities exist for government, and who do they hire? One example in the news was a few weeks ago, the Prime Minister of the UAE announced and requested how can governments safely use ChatGPT. So if you can touch on the opportunities for government stakeholders.
So at the first level, I don't think there's that much difference between how governments use these tools and how companies or other organizations do. I think governments are probably not going to get in the business of generating foundational new generative AI tools, but they are going to need to hire people who know how to use generative AI tools. They're going to need to know what applications are appropriate and what aren't. They're going to need to know all the kinds of things that a company would need to know to take advantage of this. I think the place where governments have a unique role is in creating the legal and regulatory framework in which these innovations can thrive. So I actually don't agree that regulation always leads to lack of innovation. Sometimes regulation, like copyrights or patents, can provide the foundation for faster innovation. That's certainly the goal, and I think in some cases, for sure, it's accomplished. So we touched a little bit on this in the last session, but I think there's some very interesting questions about what specific kinds of regulatory and legal things would be helpful in the generative AI space. I think one of the most, I'll mention two actually. One of the most obvious is the question that came up about if you've trained your generative AI model on things that other people own copyrights on, are you infringing their copyright when your system generates something new? I think it's difficult, and we need something new to go on here because you're not actually copying their data. I understand that in some cases you can get a generative AI system to spit out something close to what some of its training data was, but it's quite unusual and usually very difficult to get that to happen. For the most part, what the generative AI systems are doing is kind of learning from, amalgamating and generalizing and stuff like that from all this vast amount of data, some of which is copyrighted, some of which isn't. But then they're generating something basically new. So in a certain sense, that doesn't seem to me that different from a human art student who looks at lots of famous paintings and takes that into account when generating their own. Is it a little different? Yeah, a little different. And maybe there's some kind of legal framework that could make this work more effectively. For instance, maybe I guess I'm going to give away a cool idea I had that we wrote about in a paper not yet published anywhere, but I'll give it to this audience. Copyright is about the right to copy something. What we're talking about here is not actually copying it, but it's learning from it. And I think maybe we need something like learn right rules. Instead of copyright, we want learn right. You have the right to learn from this, and people could kind of agree or not agree to give an AI system the right to learn from what I created, which would be very different from the right to completely copy what I created. So that's an example of one thing that I think would be pretty cool. Another thing that people worry a lot about with generative AI is its ability to create lots of false stuff. You could create intentionally fake news, or you could hallucinate like a lot of the GenAI systems are doing now and make people think that it's true and it's not. So I think I think it's unlikely that we could be successful in ever developing automatic systems or even human systems that could always determine whether something was factually true or not. In part because even we humans don't always agree on whether something is factually true or not. So I think what we could hope for is the right to, or the ability to see the provenance, the history of where this thing I'm looking at came from. So in general, what we humans really do, I think, is believe the things that lots of people we trust say. So if we have a good way of telling whether this piece of information came from someone we trust, whether that's New York Times or Fox News or whoever it is, depending on what you trust, if we had a way of telling where this piece of information came from, that would give us, and if that were kind of guaranteed by the transmission system that got it to us, that would give us a pretty good basis for knowing whether we want to believe this piece of information or not. So that requires, maybe it's some new legal framework, maybe it can happen just from things like trademarks and so forth, as we talked about in the last session. So it requires maybe some legal innovation and certainly some technical innovation to be sure that we've preserved the integrity of the information and its source all the way to the person who's consuming it. So those are two things I think that governments could do and would be very useful to do.
Great. So we've coined two terms on this panel, learn right and the GenAI economy definition. But Tom, I wanted to double click on the point regarding regulation with government stakeholders. On the panel earlier with Vinod Khosla, and he mentioned a quote from Kai-Fu Lee that in the US, if a self-driving car kills a person, regulators step in, but in China, if a self-driving car kills a person, they go faster to figure out how to solve it. What's the balance there? Because it feels like there's a shortage of independent experts for the government side. Where do they even start with government understanding all of this and fostering more innovation?
So I did hear Vinod's talk online, and I think he gave the right answer, which is that it's somewhere in between. It's hard to say exactly where, and it depends a lot on the situation and so forth. I think you can err on either side. Some people err on the side of being too experimental, going too far, too fast before we know what it can do. It's also certainly possible to err on the other side of being too conservative and not being willing to try anything until we've proved for sure that it couldn't possibly cause any harm. That would certainly impede innovation. I guess I don't have any secret formula about how to know where the right boundary is in between, but I think it's certainly an important thing for us to think about.
This isn't really my area of expertise, but I feel like we've solved these problems before. We've had to think about these. If you think about the history of space travel, which I've been thinking about a lot because my son is very into space, and we got tremendous number of innovations from that process, but we still pushed forward even when there was risk. And I feel like a lot of thought went into how to tread that line. And it feels like anytime we push innovation forward, we have the same sort of tension. And so maybe if we start looking back to historical examples, space, other places, we could figure out a little bit about where we've tread the line before and what guided us in those principles.
I think that's a good direction. I'm not sure space travel has all the answers. I mean, one thing they did there was to say the risks are primarily taken by people who very knowingly agree to take those risks, like well-trained astronauts. In the case of generative AI, there may be lots of other people who don't even know they're taking risks. So I think we should certainly look at a lot of innovations in the past and learn whatever lessons we can from them, but there may be some new kind of distinctions we have to make with this new technology.
Yeah, that's a great point.
It's also an education problem because Now the difference is those with the AI background and education, that somebody said earlier about lowering the barrier. If you lower the barrier too much, you almost remove the educational merits in the process, and then all of a sudden everyone is a user, and creating platforms that have no merits or educational background behind them, and it just causes more problems in the system.
Well, sometimes letting people with less educational background do things is a good thing. One of the things we've done in our research, and have a working paper about it now on the archive.org system, is doing code generation, that is software code, where we had people generating HTML code by describing what they wanted in English and then moving things around on a screen where they were generated. We found that doing this let professional HTML programmers generate their code about 30% faster than they could have done in the traditional way. We also tried it with non-programmers, people who couldn't write HTML at all themselves. We found that using this tool, the non-programmers were able to generate HTML code about as fast, about as well, and more cheaply than the programmers. So in other words, we gave people who couldn't have done this at all themselves before. We also used a system that couldn't have done it by itself at all either, but the two of them together were able to do things that neither of them could have done before, and that is potentially economically more desirable. Now, some people might worry, is this going to put the programmers out of work? In this case, at least, I'm not too worried about that, because I think these programmers, instead of spending their time on simpler stuff that other people with less skill could do, can now spend their time on the essentially unlimited number of challenges that exist for how to use computers in more creative ways.
Definitely unlimited challenges exist, and lots to do in that space. Dor, just switching gears, there was some talk earlier about the responsive moderating the content. How do you scale generative AI responsibly? It's not a tech problem, it's a people problem, especially in your domain where you produce bias-controlled, machine-generated reports. In the financial sector, there's a responsibility to screen and moderate and output and escalate that content. How do you do it at Bridgewise?
So first, you have to have a very good insurance policy. And then, of course, you have, for me, it's all about, again, being very practical. It's all about explainability. But again, I'm not the tech guy. I'm more in the business side. So being practical, on the actual, I'd say, product generation side, you have to control the input in order to control the output. So in our case, we control both the training data. It's not an open-ended, open source data that we harvest and then digest. But we try to be very strict on the data we put into the machine before, of course, making the final conclusion of that analysis report. But then also on the output, you have to control it and not give it, again, not giving the machine the ability to say everything, but again, at least on our case, be very regulated also in the way we train the machine to translate the thought process of the actual analysis. And also on the other side, I believe explainability should take place facing the users, facing the clients. The more we, I'd say, companies and product providers will be able to explain the clients in a human way, the thought process and the process of the product generation, the better it will be. The better it will be used by them, the more they will use it, because it's a trust thing. If my mother could not understand the way our machine is generating the financial analysis of Tesla or Apple, she would not trust it. Especially, again, of course, being able to understand and read it in human language, in her mother tongue, will help. But without being able to understand how it came to the conclusion eventually, she wouldn't trust it. Therefore, the commercial side would not happen. So again, explainability both for us creators, being able to understand how the product or what is the thought process of the machine, as much as possible, of course. And on the other hand, the users must understand how it works, otherwise it will not scale business-wise.
The user side, definitely important. Yeah, Tom?
Can I kind of respond to that a minute?
Sure.
A lot of people today have talked about explainable AI and how it has to be explainable before we can really use it, et cetera. I think explainable AI is great, and the more we can explain, the better. But I think we may worry more than we need to about that, because we're all used to dealing with some other intelligent entities in the world called humans, who often can't explain what they do at all. Even if they try, we can't understand them, and many times when they try, they have no idea why they did it themselves. So I think that in the real world, we often trust humans to do all kinds of intelligent activities that neither they nor we can explain how they did it, but if they have a good track record, if we trust them, then it's fine. We don't really have to know how they did it. Some people do things by gut feel, and they have been shown to have a good gut, and we trust that.
Can I counter?
Sure.
I use, of course, in our practical day-to-day, we face regulators, like the SEC, the Israeli Stock Authority, different securities agencies around the world. And I can tell you they would, unfortunately, 3 years ago, they would trust way more an MIT graduate than they trust an algorithm, even if the MIT graduate is using its gut. So in the end of the day, to get that trust of, again, regulators in a very regulated industry, but eventually the bankers, the investors, you must be able to explain. The only reason is because you're right about even the human thought process is not fully explainable in some cases, but it is the way it used to be for decades. So being able, in order to change that, you must follow some rules that us humans, again, must comply to before we actually change it from the old way to the new way of doing stuff.
Don't you think some regulators would be convinced if you could say, we can't explain exactly how this works, but it's 95% more accurate than humans in these thousands and thousands of cases we've looked at?
So we have 70% accuracy rate, which is way higher than the human 50%-ish. I can tell you it was very hard to go through the SEC and ISA and all of the different regulators, although demonstrating live results and use cases that, again, that's my experience.
Maybe that's the problem with the regulators then, not the technology.
Yeah, exactly, Tom. It's the education component for the regulators. How do they come into the ecosystem and understand the technology so that they can make these decisions, whether it's a 50% accuracy or more that's required, or 70%? We have less than about 2 minutes left, so we're going to go through just a couple of questions. Yeah. Catherine, just to get more granular on specifics of jobs, prompt engineering was mentioned earlier, maybe as a crucial role or not. What about the role of a UI designer to make it easier to get the results we're seeking to complement these writing text prompts?
I think we've been talking about this one way or another, the whole panel, right? I think when we think about any kind of advanced AI in technology, it's equally a UI and interaction design problem as it is an AI problem, right? You have to integrate it in a way that makes sense for individuals' workflows. You have to make it trustworthy. Sometimes you have to make it explainable. All these things, right? And I think as we think about sort of human-centered AI, usability becomes a huge part of it. And we just need to acknowledge that.
Great. Tom, I wanted to make sure we get this question in before the panel ends around strategy. Strategy is ultimately how a company attains superior performance. Maybe some of the work you've done in your lab, if you can share about how the job of a strategy practitioner changes with GenAI.
Yeah, I don't think we have time to do a full version of this, but just very quickly, two things. One is One of the things we're doing in our lab right now is working on using generative AI to help come up with innovative ideas about how to organize a company, how to do organizational design, not software or hardware design. We're very excited about that. We've got a new system we're about to try out with my MBA class starting next week, and hopefully to make it available to the public not too long after that. The other thing is covered in much more detail in my book, Superminds. There's a whole chapter there about how humans and computers could potentially do corporate strategic planning in really innovative new ways, involving far more people than are involved now, and also AI in a lot of different ways, to generate many possible components of many possible strategic plans, and to evaluate those things by both humans and computers in various ways. And you could imagine a company that uses a strategic planning process like this could sense and respond to things its competitors did or the things that happen in the market so much faster than its competitors, they might be able to run circles around their competitors. So if you want more details of that, look in Superminds.
Great, thank you so much. Round of applause to Sid and Sam and everyone in the panel. Thank you.
Could you speak a little bit to us as how you see this transition going on in AI?
Well, I'll begin by saying that I have never seen anything like this in my career. I'm incredibly excited. And, you know, the speed at which advances are happening, I don't think we've experienced before. And the breadth of what it's going to affect, I don't think, you know, so I can talk about VMware and how it was radical, you know, in its systems area, and the challenges with getting people to adopt it, if you'd like. But in terms of, you know, a shift going on in the world, a moment in history, I think this is quite a bit bigger. VMware, you know, we were this whole new way to run your systems, and nobody saw the need for it. And you try and explain all the things it could do. We don't have that problem with generative AI. It's immediately useful. But the thing I noticed, I feel like there's an echo. Is there? No?
Here in a little. Yeah, I don't know. No.
Okay, it's okay. We had to, so I think a lot of things are going to get rethought about, you know, so the professor was, a Sloan professor was just talking about how corporate strategy might be done differently. I think everything's going to be done differently once people figure it out. And, you know, how I was like, yeah, corporate strategy's done differently, but as you're doing that corporate strategy, how do you even know what's possible when you have all these other tools that you can do things in a different and more powerful way? So let me get specific. Like VMware, we developed a way to take a running virtual machine that was running on a physical piece of hardware and move it to another physical machine with no service interruption, okay? So, because we virtualized the hardware and through checkpointing trickery we could do this, well, like that seemed impossible to people. And so they couldn't really imagine why it would be useful. And that's the kind of challenge we have here, is how to rethink, you know, so all of a sudden systems management could be done, you know, everybody used to always think if you were going to upgrade a system, you had to do it on the weekend, you know, maybe Sunday morning at 1 a.m. and everything. And it was just too weird to be able to do it in the middle of the day on a weekday. And so nobody would buy this functionality. I mean, in hindsight, you wouldn't do a cloud with, we called it vMotion. I thought it was a good name. But, you know, you wouldn't consider going to a cloud that didn't have that ability today because you take it for granted. I don't know if that's a good example, but it's just an example of how open-minded you have to be when there's such a major enhancement to how, you know, this augmented intelligence or this better intelligence. Then I'm still trying to figure out where is the gap between what is it that humans will be able to do better than this new intelligence?
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense. I'm curious, as you touch on just how there was a widespread appeal to generative AI that is different from the environment you faced, is there something in this space that has you most excited that you look forward to seeing develop the most?
Well, I'm really glad to be alive right now. It's, you know, I'm glad to be a part of it. And you know, it's hard to predict everything that's going to change. But, you know, when I personally think about things, you know, my experience is a lot of big software systems. So I've spent some time thinking about, well, you know, starting from scratch right now, how radically different you would make them with this ability to put all the data together and then ask it to synthesize the data for you. Changes everything. So whether it's an ERP system or a game building system or, you know, you name it.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I'm curious if we kind of dig in a little more specifically, if we talk about cloud maybe as an example, how do you see, you've spent so much time in the field of cloud and virtualization, do you see any specific impacts, maybe more on the hardware side that could impact different startups and AI that might pop up in this space, or how do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a pretty interesting dynamic where, you know, we have Azure and AWS and Google Cloud, and now NVIDIA's building a cloud. And the government's making noise about building a cloud. I hope they can move quickly because, you know, I'm sure you guys all know. I mean, Jensen Huang says that the amount of processors going into this is doubling every 3 months. That's a lot, you know, in 10 years, it's over 1 million times. And so these clouds are where you want to do this stuff, right? And then it gets to which model do you want to do it in? And there's a really interesting question about whether there's going to be a network effect. And it looks like there is. So I have a friend that's building an AI company, generative AI company in finance, doing really useful stuff. Her customers just love, you know, they're willing to give her money after a few months, and you know, it's pretty successful. And so she said, well, I think what's going to happen is they'll, for something super high value, such as predicting markets or something, there'll be highly specialized, special purpose model, and then a long tail that maybe it's OpenAI, who knows, will solve all the other problems and people just use their APIs. I think if I had a finance company doing generative AI, I would say that too. But, you know, one of the, I mean, just as a counter, and I'd be curious what other people think, but as a counter, if you think about it, one of the unbelievable strengths is that it's seen almost all the data in the world, and it can connect very disparate things. all kinds of knowledge that and so it seems like the more it has, and like, I don't know, I was reading, there's what is it, 100, I forget, 150, what's the order of magnitude parameters?
150 billion? Might be
150 billion parameters today in GPT-3, and they're about to come out with one with 350 billion. So you think that there might be a network effect with the bigger model and the more data, and they're partnering with all these people, so they're seeing all this data. And will there just be one model that everybody wants to use, and the more they use it, the more they want to use it? Or will there, I was talking to some people at MIT today, from the CS department, world expert types, and, they think they have a better model than OpenAI, and they probably do, who knows? But, so the dust hasn't settled on how to build the best model, that's for sure. But there, it's moving. One thing, when I heard Jensen Huang talking the other day, I was in a little round table with him. He's like, this thing is moving so fast that if you're not doing it and you're not on that train, forget it, Mm-hmm. And so it's a very interesting period.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I like your point, too, of just the different, depending on where a startup might want to enter the market, there's very different barriers to entry. If they want to try and create those large language models, they'll certainly need a large amount of capital and compute to compete in that space versus...
And expertise and data and, yeah.
I'm curious, just to maybe dig a little more on that, do you see a specific space where startups can acquire more value and really capture that? Do you think it's more, like you were saying, in the specialization
Oh, no, there's
of
so
data
many. In any domain in the world, you could use the APIs and maybe your own data and do things in a brand new way that is far more effective than the way you've been doing it. And so I think there's a tremendous amount of opportunity for people to build applications, and they don't have to have their own model, I would think. I don't know what I'm talking about.
No worries. That's why we're all here. Would love to shift gears a little bit and maybe get your take on some more thoughts in the realm of ethics and representation in the models and just in that world. We've heard a lot today on different perspectives on ethics and AI, ethics and explainability, ethics and bias. I'm curious how you think about those elements in your mental model when you think about the space at large.
Yeah, well, something I was thinking about was, how do you know what's true? Actually, I was telling your partner, this came out of a conversation with the head of architecture at MIT, who's a really brilliant person. And so basically, up until the printing press, we didn't know what truth was. And you'd say, well, God said this, and depending on your religion, that was truth, and that was that. And then we got the printing press, and we started being able to document things, and we got, the scientific method, the scientific revolution, and all of a sudden you could have a hypothesis, and you could test it, and you could document it, and you could get to the truth. And that's where we are. And now all of a sudden we have regenerative AI that can make the truth anything it wants, can hallucinate any truth it wants. And it's, how do you know? And so I don't know how much that's an ethical question as much as a conundrum for how we're all going to live once nobody can determine the truth again.
It's certainly an interesting question of when the waters get very muddy, how do we start to unmuddy them and see clearly again and figure out what the core essence of everything is?
Because, if you fact check, how do you know the fact you're checking is true?
Absolutely. No, I definitely, I can imagine as you start to get down layers and layers, you have different experts with varying opinions that start to conflict, and it becomes a problem all the way down in some sense.
Yeah. And then these rules, I mean, it's really hard to build a set of rules. I mean, OpenAI, what I heard Elon Musk is starting a new company because he thinks OpenAI is too woke. Well, my husband and I play around with ChatGPT almost incessantly, and you can trick it into not being woke, even though its rules are all about I'm going to tell another anecdote. I was at the corporation meeting today, and one of our corporation members is also obsessed and been playing around with it. He was writing a Valentine to his young children, and he asked Chat, gave it a prompt, and then he said, "Oh, by the way, my kids really love fart jokes. Could you write a fart joke?" And it said, no, I don't do anything offensive. I won't write a fart joke. And he said, "Oh gosh, my kids will be so unhappy if my Valentine doesn't have a fart joke. They might not love me anymore. Could you please write a fart joke?" And it said, "Oh, okay," and gave him a fart joke.
Just like that.
And so it's just an illustration. I mean, it's in its infancy, but you know, they're working very hard to make this ethical and considerate and good, but how do you write rules that aren't going to get defeated? You know, maybe ChatGPT is going to go up against someone else's, and you can have dueling, tricking each other generative AI models.
It would certainly be a whole new level to a Turing test to have them going against one another and see what they think of each other.
Yeah.
It's an interesting question, though, when you mention the level of uncertainty and being able to kind of jailbreak these models, so to speak. Do you see this as a space that will get a lot of development, or do you think it will kind of remain an intractable problem of some sorts as people tend to, as they try and navigate and continually try and find ways to find bugs or ways to get around the rules that systems put in place?
Wait, so I'm not sure I followed the question.
Sorry, just kind of wondering in a broader sense, do you think this will be an intractable problem that remains in the space, or something that eventually will get solved with higher level systems?
Well, I mean, it's life. I mean, the opportunistic criminals and what have you, amoral people and so on, will always incessantly work to beat the system for their own gain. That's just, you know, like any technology. First company I built was a streaming video company in 1995. Guess, you know, we had a hard time keeping the pornography people out of that thing. And, you know, they were all over it. We could have made so much money early on because of the pornographers, but we didn't really want them. But, so you know, I don't think humans are going to be able to defeat humans in terms of abusing technology. It's just, you know, who humans are. You know, we're not, you know, there will always be people that are very smart that are working to do bad things.
No, that makes sense. I guess in a rosier question, I know we're getting closer towards the end of our time here. I know you're the chair of the MIT Corporation. Obviously, you graduated from MIT, as we mentioned earlier. As a member and a leader of this community, how do you think the world will be different for MIT graduates in 2030 versus today?
Yeah, that's like an amazing question that nobody can answer. But clearly, I think the roles that are out there today in 5 years will probably be pretty different. And everybody will just go to UBI. No, I'm kidding. That's universal basic income. But you know, like Sam Altman has got a little startup working on UBI. That's how much he believes in it. That's a lot of MIT graduates. No, no. So basically, it'll be a world where you want to learn. You want to have very deep expertise, but yet when you're doing something, you have to think kind of from first principles, and I mean, one idea I had was it's almost like so I run a bunch of companies, and what I do when I run a company is I try and surround myself with people way smarter than me, and I try and figure out, and I listen to all of them, and I try and get us all, we try and all figure out what we want to go do and do it together. And now you're going to have this superior intelligence that everybody gets. Not just, the CEO's really lucky. They can pick all the people that they think are the smartest and work,
right.
Very closely with them. And now everybody's going to have this assistant that in many ways has a superior intelligence to any human being. And so figuring out how to harness that to do whatever your goals are is going to be what an MIT graduate will probably be doing, I would think.
That makes a lot of sense, and luckily the community seems to reflect that, and there's a lot of teaching in the first principles, so I think they'll be well equipped to handle that shift, like you mentioned. Hopefully. I guess we'll find out. Kind of along that vein, I'm curious for like an MIT student who might be in the audience or watching online, what advice would you have for them if they were to go and start a company in this GenAI wave, how they might think about it?
Yeah, well, there's kind of, like over in the MIT, like CSAIL lab, they're all doing companies that are really computer science, new techniques in computer, new kind of model, new kind of explainability. They're doing the technology, and the technology has got a long way to go, so there's plenty of opportunity there. And then there's this other thing where you're figuring out how to exploit this new technology to do things in a much more powerful way, and that applies to every single domain. And so depending on which category you're interested in, there's probably more categories, but that's a simplistic way of categorizing it. You want to have super deep domain experience. You want to have been out there in the world doing whatever it is you think you want to build an application to do better. And so that you really understand deeply how it's done today and can see what the opportunities are for completely, for taking advantage of this new tool.
No, that makes sense. I think just to blend it all together as well, to help combat the level of uncertainty and information of having that deep expertise and building from first principles for yourself to know where you're really working, what is and is not true, and having that domain understanding, like you said, would be just a good way to tie it all together. That makes sense.
Okay.
I guess as one kind of last question that could be a little fun. So AI, we've seen a lot of these models can find things that are pretty undetectable in the world for humans. They tend to find new and novel patterns that emerge, for example, with like AlphaZero. I'm curious what you think for a more powerful AI. What do you think if they were to observe us, what bugs do you think they would find in humans? Intended or unintended?
Well, gosh, what a philosophical question. In my experience, I kind of categorize people into two categories when I'm working with them, and there's a category of people that are just out for themselves and they try and pretend like they're helping you, but what they're really doing is figuring out how to push themselves forward. And then there's another category of people that wants to, be part of a group that has a shared purpose and is putting that ahead of themselves and everything else. And, whenever I run a company, I try and sort out the ones that are, their agenda's not, what we're all trying to do. So certainly, I'm not sure what your question was, but certainly this system, I would think generative AI could find that pretty quickly.
No, that makes sense. So just weeding out a lot of the some of the self-serving people that might pop up along the journey.
Devious, I saw on one of the boards out here some Sloan study that said trust is underrated, and there was some study that it turned out, I think it was for salespeople, trusting the person you're buying a product from doesn't improve the sales at all. Trust didn't matter. I thought that was pretty fascinating, and I was thinking about it, and so I think there's a certain ability to know more about everything that's happening and query about everything that's happening so that you can, you'll be able to, for your model of how you think the world should be and for your model of what you think the truth is, you'll be able to see if there's alignment, maybe. This is pretty abstract.
No worries. That's wonderful. Well, I think with that, we're at time. But Diane, thank you so much for coming. We truly appreciate you being here and having you aboard. Thank you.
Can I get this? Oh, thank you. Right here. Folks, just before we go, I want to thank all of you so much for coming. This was our, as we said, inaugural GenAI Summit, and we're just so grateful to have such a big community that's so excited about it. So first, I want to thank all the speakers. If we get one more round of applause for the speakers. You were all incredible, truly. Second, the sponsors, thank you for making this possible. And then third, as I said before, this came together in just 9 weeks. And so if we could get a round of applause for those folks who worked so hard to organize it. Thank you all so much. I hope you have a great evening. If the speakers could come down for one photo, that'd be great. Thank you all so much again. Good night. Yeah.
Volunteers and moderators too, we would love to have you down.